Um, so I will briefly introduce myself. I am Evan Perlman. I am a writer for the Miskatonic repository, a leader of community collaborations. We've done a number of group projects there, and have some things in the queue for Chaosium that I have great hopes for seeing the light of day someday. And I will turn it. Oh, well, I guess I have introductions, but you can add to them. So let me begin with Lynne Hardy, who's the associate editor of Call of Cthulhu. And do you want to say anything more?
Well, I've promoted myself recently. I'm claiming I'm now the senior associate editor.
Ooh, excellent.
That's only because only because I've been doing it longer than Jamie, Harris, and Paul.
Excellent. Um, then we have Patrick Chandler and Francis Acquarone. Could you please? I know that I've previously misstated your actual affiliations with the publishing, so could you explain who you are and what you've written?
Yeah, maybe I'll start, Patrick, if that's okay with you. Yeah, thanks. Well, first and foremost, thanks for the opportunity and for the chance to be with other distinguished panelists. For us, it's really cool. It's a great opportunity. So thank you. So Patrick and I, we collaborate together. We've been collaborating for over, I think, 6, 7 years. And we pitch projects to the Sons of Singularity. And so far, we've done a number of projects, and I'll turn it to Pat, who can add to that.
Yeah, thanks. And echoing Francis's appreciation and thanks for having us here. So we've done a number of projects in recent years. We've done Journal d'Indochine, which took place in 1920s to 1940s Vietnam. We recently did The Blessed and the Blasphemous, which was North Africa around the onset of World War II. So that was a big project that we did recently. And there are a few others that we'll possibly touch on as we go through the discussion today. But I think maybe I'll leave it at that by way of introduction. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We're really excited to have you both here. And we also have John Crowdis, who is one of our MR writers. Hey, John has 3 publications on the repository now, one of which has been in the top 10 since it debuted at the end of July. John has a BA in history and a master's in divinity, which includes focuses on church history and biblical and ancient languages, which I'm gonna say are probably useful for handouts and cursing your recalcitrant players. But John has done some really excellent work, and I think it's really helpful to see more voices in the community in the repository. So glad to have you. So what we'll do is we have some general discussion topics. We'll get started. I will pick people more or less at random, starting with Lynne. I would ask panelists generally, to keep responses around a minute or less. But I'm not going to sit here with a stopwatch, but this way I don't have to glower at you. And we will, and as questions come in, we can address those when there's a natural break in the conversation. So could you first, I think we've mentioned some of the works that you've all done, but could you pick one of your historical scenarios or two and talk about the one that really felt the most rewarding, that if you want to go back to again and again as an example for this discussion, let's kind of cue that up now. So let's start with Lynne there.
Okay, well, XP Lovecut, I noticed, has already mentioned the one I was going to say, which is Children of Fear. It took a lot longer than I was expecting. It's don't ever try to do that. It's a stupid movie. You think I'd have learned the first time. And also,
Is Lynne just freezing for me, or is it? No, okay, Lynne, I think we're having some trouble with your.
Yeah, it's the same on my side, Evan. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna go on then to Patrick and Francis, and we'll come back to Lynne when the Gremlins release her. Same question to you guys.
Okay. Again, Pat, do you mind if I start and then? Okay, fantastic. So when it comes to writing historical scenarios, I tend to focus on periods that are lesser known and have only marginally been touched upon by other writers, which brings me to Journal d'Indochine that Patrick mentioned. Probably one of the most rewarding projects that I had a chance to work on. The Vietnam War is something that the North American audience knows fairly well, but the earlier French occupation of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia is much less talked about. I lived in Asia for 17 years, so I had a chance to travel extensively in the region. I've always been fascinated by its history, culture, and people. On top of that, my grandfather lived in Vietnam for 2 years in 1953 and 1954. So I was incredibly lucky that I had access to his memoirs and countless photos from that time. It's one of those things where history becomes more than just research. And as a fellow historian, John, I'm sure you'll relate to that. But it's something where I felt personally connected to, and that really drove me forward with the project. It was a massive endeavor, and Patrick can attest to it. 2 volumes, 3 years of work, a team of 6 authors, all of us juggling full-time jobs. But I'm really proud of what we accomplished, and incorporating those personal elements is really what made it truly special for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and Patrick.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I certainly agree with Francis that Journal d'Indochine was very rewarding to work on. As I mentioned earlier, The Blessed and the Blasphemous was another project, and for me, that one was particularly rewarding. So by all means, it was a successful Kickstarter that we ran. As far as I'm concerned, by my humble standards, it sold well, so there was definitely an appetite, and that's always a good indicator. But for me, the genesis of my enthusiasm in the project came from when Francis brought some initial research to me and said, look, I've been kind of reading into this setting and doing some research on North Africa during that time period. And for me, that was, I was instantly kind of sold on the idea, because I actually have some personal connections to that region. So my parents actually met in North Africa. My sisters and I were born in Libya. So this for me was really an opportunity to kind of explore some of those family connections that we have in that region, to get out the old photographs and dig through the family albums. And so you'll see some of those reflected in the finished product, in the book, photos of, North African scenery and Carthaginian ruins, etc. So that was really, really meaningful for me to kind of do all that research and then bring sort of that personal side and that authenticity, I hope, to the project. So that was really, really meaningful for me. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's
Thanks.
great. That's a great jumping off place for the next piece. And John?
Well, for me, I've had 3 publications now on Miskatonic repository. I mean, I've done other work in the past for Iron Crown and for Fantasy Flight, just as a freelance writer, but specifically for the Miskatonic repository. The one that drew me in is like 2 of the scenarios that I actually have are actually part of serialized campaign. The idea is writing one scenario, letting it finish, sending it out, and then picking up and continuing on. Which my very first scenario that the series is the overall series is called Al-Azif Unearthed, and the premise behind it was Dead Sea Scrolls but evil. Is the idea behind it, and so looking at the process, knowing what I know in terms of the background of the Dead Sea Scrolls itself, and then putting it in the setting, and then getting into the research of things like the Arab Revolt. Now, the thing is, none of that is actually part of the scenario. What is part of the scenario, and one of the inspirations of is that how the scenario starts, and it's based on an actual historical event that seems almost like sometimes like truth is stranger than fiction. Is that there appeared in 1954 an ad for ancient scrolls in the Wall Street Journal, where someone had gotten a hold of some of the early discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls before they were widely known, and was advertised in the Wall Street Journal. So I took that premise, except instead of finding you know, something that was of a biblical nature, is what happens if it was a precursor to the Necronomicon. And so hence why, and this time it appears in the Boston Globe, and then the scenario evolves from there. And it was, that was a lot of fun to put together. And then it's, where has that gone? And there's more to add there, but I'm just going to leave it there at that point.
We got plenty of time. We got plenty of
Oh,
time.
yeah.
We'll come back. We'll come back. Lynn, good to have you back. Thank you. We were greatly concerned for your safety.
My internet has been really flaky all week, and it was reasonably stable yesterday. So of course it picks the beginning of a panel to decide that it's not going to play. For some bizarre reason, turning flight mode on and off seems to reactivate it. I
Interesting.
have no idea why.
All right. Well, don't question it too deeply, right? It works. That's all
I'm
we need
not
to know.
questioning it.
Did you want to say a little more
My
about Children of
apologies.
Fear? All we heard, I think all we heard was the word stupid, and then that was it. So
Yes, that was the never let anybody convince you that writing a campaign on your own is a smart idea. It's not. Yeah, so Children of Fear was a huge amount of fun to research and to write. It took a lot longer than intended because obviously Masks of Nyarlathotep had happened in the middle of that. But one of the other ones that I'm very fond of, which isn't out yet, is something called The Church on the Hill, as its
Ooh.
working title. Some of you may have played it at various conventions. I have run it a few times now, which is set at a place called Breedon on the Hill in England. And I actually got to go there to do research during the Jubilee celebrations for Queen Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee, complete with beacon lighting and everything. So it was very atmospheric. It was a fantastic weekend of wandering up and down the big hill to the church and getting lots of reference photos. So that's what I'm very fond of. So fingers crossed,
Right.
sometime reasonably soon in a Gaslight collection.
Fantastic. That's exciting. There's a lot of things coming out for Gaslight. This is going to be really great. This is going to be great. So what, I get, you've all touched on this a little bit, but what I'd like to dig into a little more is, you need obviously some motivation, some desire to write in a setting. What draws you to a particular setting? What makes you want to work there? Let's start with John this time and work our way backwards.
Right now, I've been sticking largely with my first one that I did was in the classic scenario, but drawing on stuff sort of leading up to that. And mostly it's partly because it's mostly familiar. The one that I released last year, the Chthonus Cabinet, was 1890s, and just getting into the East London vibe was something of imagining. I mean, I live on the west coast of Canada, and so for me, it's a lot of imagination and a lot of trying to get into that and that feel.
That's great. Thank you. And Pat or Patrick, sorry, do you prefer Patrick or Pat? I'm sorry.
Either or is
Okay.
perfectly fine with me. So no worries. So what kind of draws me to certain what are my draws? Look, real world events amplify horror. These are generally speaking great settings to explore because a lot of the horror is already there. So this is things like geopolitical conflict, wars, natural disasters, human or otherwise. So these are great things, and these are big draws to me because they can serve as not just the backdrop and existential threats, but you can use them to delve deeper and build depth in a particular setting. On top of that, themes like cosmic horror, I feel, are really great fits for kind of after the 1920s. You've got post World War I trauma still lingering in people's minds. You've got pressure building up to World War II. So there are so many things going on in that period of time that lend to horror stories. And then additionally, I like to look at survival aspects and what are settings where I can make it for the players. They're not, just dealing with the interpersonal connections and relationships, but they're also dealing with a survival element. And perhaps they only have the tools of that time period to assist them. I think for me, that's really, really fun, adding kind of an additional layer of tension and fear to a story. I mean, you know, the way in which we solve problems today was vastly different, and in many cases vastly more challenging when we had a whole different set of tools at our disposal. So I like leveraging a lot of that, and I'll pass it on after that.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. Francis?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I definitely agree with both John and Patrick. And maybe to expand a little bit, I mean, I also see history as a rich tapestry, right? It offers an endless source of inspiration. And when you're writing horror-based role-playing games like Call of Cthulhu, I mean, it's crucial in my view to not to look at history as just a series of dates, events, or grand narratives, but really as a collection of unique moments, as 2 points, Pat, right? Moments that are full of ambiguities and unknowns. And it's these moments, often shrouded in mystery, that offer the perfect foundation for horror. So I strive to find historical happenings that are so bizarre that usually they defy logical explanation, events where the only plausible answer seems to be a supernatural one. It's almost like if the unknown is already inviting something, you know, spooky to step in. So it makes it easier as a writer, right, to weave in the horror. For example, like we talked about Journal Indochine and the Blessed and Blasphemous. For Journal Indochine, I was captivated by the Chaldai religion. No spoilers, but if you have a chance, read about the Chaldai religion or pick up a copy of the Journal Indochine. And for Blessed and the Blasphemous, I loved exploring the potential legacy of the Carthaginian Empire, but through a supernatural lens. One point I would also add, and it's really crucial for me, you have to pick a period that interests you. Passion is crucial. If you're not fascinated by the time, the location, the people, it's going to reflect and it's going to show in your writing. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lynne?
Yeah, Francis is completely right. It's always harder to write about things that you're not passionate about. And Patrick also made a very good point, as did Francis, that there are weird things out there that you find when you're researching that take the tiniest twist to actually make them cosmic horror. You know, that a lot of the work has already been done for us. It's finding those elements that's the interesting challenge, really. It's always easier to sell the lie when it's rooted in truth. So having that is crucial, having that element of truthfulness about the setting. But also we are dealing with horror, we're dealing with cosmic horror. So a historical background, again, coming back to something that Patrick said, is the fact that we are people of the late 20th and early 21st century, depending on how old we are. And we're used to doing things a certain way. Your investigators are from a totally different time period to their players, who may not understand everything about that historical or even geographical location. So you're adding in an extra layer of otherness because they're not necessarily completely familiar as players with how the world worked then.
Thanks. Yeah, and I want to just add a couple from my own experience. One, you know, just echoing and thirding the idea that if you find something strange that happened and it's inadequately explained, go ahead and explain it. That's fantastic. So I have a Baltimore source book is in the queue, and my favorite bizarre little thing about Baltimore in the 1920s was that there was a guy on his own steam, just in his garage, building a rocket to Venus, and everybody in the neighborhood knew about it. They were like, "Oh yeah, that's just the rocket to Venus guy," and I was like, "Well, I got to do something with that because that is delightful, and that's a very, you know, it's the as you learn about the setting, you're like, yeah, that's in character, right? That's a Baltimore thing." But the other thing that draws me in is the natural tension. Right, is that if you have a setting, you know, like we have in Indochina, right, in that setting where things are about to explode, you can pick any mythos, any supernatural element that excites you, and just drop it in there and let human nature cause a ton of its own chaos, which is great. So any place that feels tense, you know, and about to pop, is good to poke at. Let's go poke. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order on the agenda because we brought up some things I want to get to now, and we're going to talk about how you use these elements of weirdness, these historical elements of horrors, even historical people or events. And there's a lot to talk about here. Um, I think we'll handle the mechanical side first, and then we'll get into some of the other considerations. So mechanically, what do you think about when you're using these things to ensure that you're using them in an effective and an interesting way, to kind of build your horror, build your fun, build your tension? And I guess let's start with Lynne again, if that's okay.
Of course. Well, the way I do it is I will start with the location that I want to work in, that I'm interested in, and I'll do my research there. And then it's very much a case of usually my subconscious putting things together when I'm thinking about something else. And can I find an interesting story to weave around these places? Sometimes it will come very quickly. Sometimes it'll be a case of, well, I've got these interesting scenes because I'd like something to happen in these locations. How do I form a coherent story to tie these all together? And it kind of really depends on, on how my brain is working at a particular given moment in time as to how quickly that will form. Quite often I'll talk these things over with my husband Richard, who's very good at going, but what if you did that? He's very handy as a writing tool. He's heard me call him that before, so he's not going to get upset, those of you who know him. So yes, it's and sometimes the research will tell you what it wants your scenario to be. This was definitely what I found with Children of Fear. I had a completely different idea for what that campaign was going to be, but as I was doing the research in the areas, several common themes started to come through, and it was like, no, this research is telling you this is what the scenario has to be, not what you thought of ahead of time. So I try not to think too hard ahead of time of what it is that I want to do. I try to let the research inform me of how I'm going to scare my players.
That's great. Thank you. Sorry, I stuck myself on mute. John?
I would absolutely second anything that Lynne has said. Is that sometimes just in the process of writing, there's the research and the writing is almost a parallel. And as you're going through certain things evolve as to where they go. And then you discover other things that are like, oh, that's a good nugget for something else. Like, for example, looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the large corpus of that, there was not associated with the ruins of Qumran, but somewhere else. There's something referred to as the Cave of Horrors, where scrolls were found, but so were 300 dead bodies or skeletons from that rough time period. It's like, there's something interesting to do at a later point. And so just in the research, you can also find there's all sorts of other things that are going to come in.
That's great. Thank you. Francis?
Yeah, some really good points, especially sort of the research and the project. It kind of almost becomes, you're researching and writing, it almost becomes like two projects at one point, right? Because you have such a wealth of information and research that you have. And I love the point that Lynne made that research almost, could drive you in a certain way. And then you start writing and thinking of new ideas and because of the research. So methodology for me is really, really important. I boiled it down to 4 key steps. I usually start with a top-down approach. I mean, I start by understanding the big picture. What was happening politically, socially, or culturally at a very specific time. For me, that's important because it will ensure that I have a good grasp on the subject. Of course, you'll always have players that will know more than you. So understanding the big aspect, the big history is important. And then from there, I go into what I would call my step 2, which is dive in and go deeper. So this is where I start looking at specific people, factions, events of a period. And again, like we've said, and I think this is the key takeaway from this panel, start exploring the forgotten or marginal aspect of history. Step 3, which is, again, also critically important, is make it immersive, right? To me, that means really understanding the world at that time. What did it look like? What did it feel like? What were people afraid of? What drove their actions? I look at the socioeconomics, the religion, culture, superstition, even architecture of that time. The goal is to create a setting that feels alive. And in my step 4, I think it's as important, especially for us, Patrick and I, because we've been writing about locations and periods that we're not necessarily very familiar with. For instance, Morocco in 1938. I call it step 4, responsible writing conduct. So working with cultural ambassadors that are based in where you're writing, where you're writing about. It's key. So for us, we had someone who was absolutely fantastic, Amina, based in Rabat, who went through all of our writing and just making sure that there were no sensitivities, no cultural sensitivities. So that for me, that's key. Thank you.
Thank you. And Patrick?
So, I mean, I'm not going to have too much to add at this point because around the table, excellent points have been made. So just beyond the actual research, what I like to do, and I'll quote Mark Twain here, and I'm probably going to butcher the quote, but this has stuck with me for some time. It's get your facts straight first, and then you can distort them as you choose. So I like to keep this in mind when I go about conducting any type of historical research, and ultimately using that as a foundation for a narrative. Once you are comfortable in your reality, in the facts, then you can start blending it with supernatural elements and weirdness. I like to exaggerate things to perhaps even add some elements of humor into it as well. One other piece that I will add, just kind of to maybe to end my thought, is when you're researching and then writing, give yourself flexibility to do more research as you're writing. As you go along, you might have a stroke of inspiration, and you might say, I need to now go back and do a little bit more research to make sure that, that's a viable inclusion, right? So you still want to get your facts straight, but give yourself flexibility to adjust and pivot, because sometimes it's not always apparent where the narrative is going right away. So keep that flexibility in mind.
So then I
Thanks.
want to, Peter in the chat has given us a couple of good questions, and I want to combine them a little bit into a macro question. So, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I do a ton of research, and we'll talk shortly about how we do our research, but you get a lot of distinct little facts that you love, right? You're like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. This is funny. This is sad. This is scary. And, as a research nerd, right, my first instinct is I just want to do a book report and just be like, look, this scenario is a thinly veiled excuse for me to show you all my research. How do we not do that, right? How do we sift through the things to pick out the stuff that directly helps the scenario and choose things to leave behind? And then related to that, as we're coming up with the supernatural or the plot connectivity, what do you all do to kind of balance true events, true people, true settings with fictional stuff to pull it together or to enhance it? I'll go to, I think, Lynne first.
Yeah, I mean, like it's you want people to know you've put the work in. Everybody wants people to know you put the work in. But as you say, it's not a book report, it's not a travelogue, it's not a history book. And the thing that you've got to keep in mind when you're doing this is this useful to the GM? Is this helping them do their job of guiding their players through this scenario? And as great as it might be, if it's not doing that job, does it need to be there? That's the key thing you have to think about for that. Can you remind me what the second part of the question was again, please?
Oh, and then how do you decide how much or when to introduce fictional elements to tie in the true element, or vice versa, right? How beholden should you be to one or the other?
I mean, it's a game, so you don't have to be 100% beholden to history. We've got mythos creatures, for heaven's sake. This isn't a truly historical game. It kind of gives it away. And it's what Patrick was talking about. It's the fact that if you understand the history, you know where those weak points are that you can push and insert things and twist things ever so slightly. There are certain, it's all about maintaining your players' suspension of disbelief. And as long as you're consistent internally within your scenario with breaking things and tweaking things, you'll get away with it. But if if it doesn't obey its own internal logic, that's when your players are going to start pausing and thinking, maybe too hard, and that's when things are going to come off the rails, basically.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but if you need to move dates around, right? If you need to move locations around, that shouldn't be a problem. Someone earlier in the chat, I think, asked about issues with changing the timeline, right?
Oh,
So
I
if
did in Children of Fear, I moved when somebody found a particular location because
okay,
it's like about 6 months out, but it worked better because, again, this isn't an entirely historical world we're dealing with. Mythos Greeblies. It allows us a little bit of leeway.
yeah. Do you sort of consider in scope, things that would massively change history? If you kicked off your scenario with, somebody preventing World War II, right? How do you feel about that? And I get, not to put my thumb on the scale, but I think, the only major downside there is that it creates a lot of work for the keeper.
It does make a lot of work for the keeper at that point. As long as you're open and upfront and go, this is an alternate history,
Yeah.
then you're not dropping it on the keeper after they've laid down their hard-earned cash to get the thing and then suddenly discovered that, oh heck, this isn't what I thought it was. Occasionally I've put box outs going, I've played with truth. I've bent the truth of when things happened. Again, I think a certain amount of honesty on the writer's part so that the GM knows what they're walking into helps. But, a bit of alternate history every now and again, that's quite good fun.
Any of the other panelists' thoughts on how to trim away, the research to get down to the essential aspects for the scenario?
If I can jump in.
Yeah, please.
And this is more of an advertisement for Leslie Horn, actually. Have a good editor.
Yes.
Particularly, she's been invaluable with trimming things out and making that really work. Having that, not just the extra set of the eyes, but that skill set to be able to say, oh, this is good. I mean, there's some things that I can do that I can trim, like I can put out like a historical note or keeper's note, just kind of to pull that out of the text. But yeah, but Leslie's advice has been absolutely valuable in anything that I've done.
I'll jump in to add a thought. So trimming things down also starts at the beginning. And what I mean by this is you need to or make a serious attempt at scoping out and defining what your project is, what you're trying to create. And once you can generally answer that question as you're researching, you start coming across little tidbits of, oh, that's really cool. Okay, double check it against the scope of your project, which ideally you're kind of doing at the beginning. And then again, the other piece to that is save something for part 2. Save something in your back pocket for a second project. You don't need to cram absolutely everything and anything under the sun into a 30-page scenario or even a 400-page campaign. Give yourself something to work on next. That's kind of it.
That's great. Thank you.
And if I may, Evan, just expand a little bit on, again, agree with the panelists, all brilliant, really useful points. Perhaps expanding a little bit to sort of the research and how to actually do it, like sort of a tangible way. I tend to do a lot of research. And maybe that will resonate well with Lynn and John as well. But like I'll put a document together that's like 30 to 40 pages of things that I found. Again, like sort of going back to those steps that I talked about the methodology, right? Socioeconomics and so on. And I present it to Patrick. And what we do from there is we put treatments. So we create very short, sort of like 2 or 3 paragraphs. Okay, based on this could be a cool scenario. This could also be another scenario. And again, we have like probably a dozen or more. We don't choose to write about all those dozen. Like to Pat's point, we'll keep a few for later. But then we start developing these treatments and bringing in the mythos, what could have happened. Again, expanding the history. If it's, if we choose to bend the truth a little bit in terms of timelines and events, then we do so, and we'll put a disclaimer in our, in our introduction of the book, right? So I think that's also one way to do it.
if I may. So I'm old-fashioned. So I have lots of these, dozens of these. Now, yeah, no, that's okay. That's just minutes for a meeting. And there's no secrets there. I'll show you the blank page.
I was
So I've
about to
got
zoom and enhance.
dozens, dozens and dozens of these things stacked around this office, that have got notes in. So when I've done my research, I will read a book, I will tab it, I will make notes based on those tabs. Then I will actually go through and type up the bits that are relevant to the scenario that's come to me, or I've sort of worked out from the research that I've done, so that I'm constantly refining and narrowing the amount of wordage that I'm looking at in as reference for that point when I start writing.
And I want to get into another consideration. You had mentioned, I think Francis, you had mentioned sensitivity readers and consultants, and this is like that, but not exactly the same thing. I think we need to address how you use historical elements with respect, right? I think the big line that many Chaosium staff have told MR writers is, do not make the mythos responsible for human evil. That's it, both philosophically and practically, right? It's unpleasant, it's demeaning, diminishing rather, but we do have, lots of really villainous people. Some of them are fun villains, some of them are appalling, things that have happened. Can you talk, if you've used those, can you talk about if you've used them directly? Have you, sort of filed the serial numbers off, or let it inspire other, how do you engage? And this is especially relevant in the horror genre, right? How do we engage with that without trivializing it, or without stepping on cultural considerations there? I think whoever
thanks.
wants to can go first. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, if you don't mind, I'll jump in. I mean, you want to create compelling antagonist forces and intriguing weirdness, right? But it is, again, you have to be very mindful of potential sensitivities. And of course, you want to avoid inappropriate content. I think the first thing is listen to your gut, right? Like that would be my first sort of instinct and trick here, is that if when you're writing and you feel there's a bit of a doubt that maybe it's not going to land well with audience, then there is no doubt, right? So if it's you feel that there's a doubt, there is no doubt. Of course, it could be tricky to find that balance between historical accuracy and the weird cosmic horror, but I think, again, if you ground the fantastical in historical reality, it helps you to kind of build it. You also want to be, again, sort of authentic, use real elements. And then again, sort of, we talked about this at length now, but maybe push the envelope a little bit and kind of look at what is beyond, what is lurking beyond the curtain when you pick an event or an actual, faction or so on. For me, when I create villains, I tend to invent fictional ones. I don't take a real historical character. I think you're able to avoid some of the sensitivities. And again, to your point, Evan, that you were mentioning, or you don't want to trivialize it, right? But these villains could be part of real historical factions. For instance, in The Blessed and Blasphemous, we have the Anin-Erbe, the Nazi think tank, but all of the villains that we have in our book, they're all fictional. If I may just add a little bit, because we talk about villains and weirdness, but I think it's as important, it's also the protagonist in your book. They have to be very, real. Basically, they have to tell their story and so on. And for those, I draw on real historical figures, especially the lesser known individuals, because they all usually have an incredible story to tell. And I'll take an example, if I may. Hélène Cazet-Benatar, she's Morocco's, that was The Blessed and the Blasphemous. So Hélène Benatar, she's Morocco's first female lawyer and human rights activist in the 1930s. She also served as the North African director of The Joint. So when we read about that, we're like, wow, it's so intriguing. What is it, right? So you have to pick up these type of real historical characters. I think that also adds a lot to the writing and to the story. Again, protagonist, real historical characters.
Right.
Yeah.
I have definitely used real people as player characters if I thought they were kind of heroic and interesting. But if you're using someone as a villain and they're not universally understood as a villain, you may want to fictionalize that, especially if they have living relatives.
Yeah, that's an interesting and important point. One I wanted to bring up is the fact that it's this in the sort of like a long time ago. So if you're talking sort of like 1600s, 1700s, it's easier to get away with real historical people as villains within living memory. And okay, it's kind of starting to slip out of living memory now, but World War II, even slightly before that, that's still, some of those people could still be alive that were affected by those people. They will certainly have family members whose lives were impacted by those people. So you've got to be a lot more considerate. Time gives you a lot more latitude in who you can and can't use. So the further back you go, the less difficult it is necessarily, but not always, to use a real person as a villain. And it is always easier to just create a cipher, amalgamate a couple of people into one, file the serial numbers off. But always at the end of the day, make sure that if there's been real atrocities committed by humans, that it's humans who are still responsible for them. They don't get the get out of jail free card with the mythos made me do it. They have to accept responsibility historically and fictionally for what they did.
Yeah. Other thoughts? I want to give about 15 minutes to nuts and bolts of research.
The only other thing to be able to add is, yes, I mean, nothing more to really to add, but there's certain places where you can drop them into real events, have characters that are involved. Like I've been talking to someone who's looking at doing a World War I scenario where you have soldiers in the trenches, and they may encounter some historical figures with that. And my encouragement in there is that you don't need to have those actual historical figures, but sort of adjacent to, even if the setting's a real one.
Excellent.
Excellent points made all around. I don't have much to add, but I will put this out there for consideration. Generally speaking, I like to use hindsight when I tackle these subjects, and and how I'm able to determine, is that person really a villain? I asked myself, how would that person stack up by today's standards? And if it's obvious that they were bad, then I generally feel pretty comfortable using them as a villain. I'm happy to use the Nazis as villains in my scenarios because it's ubiquitous as far as I'm concerned. They're the bad ones. So there are ways to kind of go about doing it. But generally speaking, I think you have to trust your intuition and kind of make a judgment call there, and be willing to open yourself up to criticism if you're perhaps portraying one thing with a bit too much bias one way or the other, right? So you have to be willing to accept that this territory is sensitive and could come with various pitfalls.
Yeah, and this is 100% not legal advice, and Lynn is probably going to have heartburn for me saying this, but at least in some sense, the truth is a defense against libel. If and we'll talk about how to get these, but one thing that I like to do is I just use newspaper quotes. I use firsthand quotes from people, and I'm like, what, this is what they actually said, and we can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they are on record in this newspaper, in this book, as stating and arguing this opinion or this thought, and we can play with that because it's out there, and if they didn't think that way, they shouldn't have said it, or vice versa. This is great, and I'm excited to find this. So let's talk about that. How do you start your research for the projects? If you have different phases, different levels of detail, what excites you? What are your tools that you use to keep track of that? I think someone asked specifically about tools for organizing. We can mention that as well. Quick spoiler, I use Google Docs and only Google Docs. I have horrible long outlines with all my sources pasted into them. Other people probably have better strategies than I. So let's talk about that a little bit, and then I'll zero in on some more specific historical questions, including this one from Aaron that I will add. which is whether we feel comfortable using photos of real people for different characters. So let's start, I guess, with Patrick.
Sorry, can you say the question again? I think
Yeah,
I
sorry, it was a
missed
lot of
part of
stuff.
it.
So your approaches for research, so tools, sites that you enjoy, resources that you're kind of going to as your first stop, and then maybe other steps along the way as you're digging in more deeply.
Yeah, sure. I mean, excellent question. I'm perhaps a bit unconventional in this sense, but maybe not. I'm sure other people will agree with a lot of this. I use a bit of everything when I research. I don't like to limit myself. So books, internet, documentaries, interviews, etc. I think these are all great for gathering facts. This for me is not my day job. It is also a hobby and a passion. And so I bring other elements of my passions into this as well too. And so I'm going to throw something out there, and perhaps it resonates. I love sourcing information from secondhand bookstores. I love it. I think the thrill of the hunt. What are you going to find? A cool book? Maybe it's inspiration, or maybe it's great historical fact that you're able to come across. So these are some of the resources and tools that I use. But again, no particular methodology that I follow. I just kind of follow my instinct, collect as much as I can, and go from there. And as I mentioned earlier, give yourself flexibility to to go outside what you've initially researched, and have that open mind. And I'll leave some of the rest for other people to touch on.
We'll go to Lynn.
Well, as you've already seen my notebooks, so, yes, I sort of, as I've mentioned earlier, I start with where would be interesting, where have we not set something, where can I go look? So usually I'll end up getting a travel guide. You might be able to see there's a few on the shelves behind me. Usually old ones, because you're not after the latest hotel prices. You don't need to know what the current restaurants are, but it's quite often travel guides will have those weird little bits of snippets of, oh, there's a ghost around the corner in this bit, or there was a mysterious thing happened over there in the 1920s, and you just go, aha, brilliant. It's books, the internet, documentaries, as Patrick said. And you will tend to find that things will lead you from different places. Old travel guides, and we're talking Baedeker, Murray, things like that, because they will give you a real feel for the historical period that you're after, particularly if you get any of the Victorian ones. The Baedekers and the Murrays, they're fantastic reads. It's what people's expectations and the sorts of things they're looking for when they're going on trips. So yes, and then once I've done all my research, made my handwritten notes, I type them up as general ones, and then I will start highlighting. This is in Word, because I'm old. And then I will highlight the relevant bits, and then I will use that when I'm writing my scenario to go back to check to make sure that I've incorporated the bits that I want to by putting a score through the bits that I've actually used. So real old school.
No, that's great. That's great. And John?
I mean, the only thing to add is primary sources are always a great place to start, even if they give, and that's like newspaper clippings. I mean, I cited that example earlier in terms of something that I actually use. But it's looking at like the primary sources being like actual newspaper articles from the period or things like that. And I mean, the great resource that we have in front of us now, we don't have to go hunting too much. Like a lot of it's right here, but the main thing there is, of course, like filtering out the wheat from the chaff. And so in that case, aiming for the primary sources as much as possible can create some wonderful inspirations for that kind of thing.
And Francis?
Absolutely agree again with everyone. Maybe I'll just say that go beyond the Wikipedia page. You want to make sure that you're able to have in-depth research, and Wikipedia pages they're great to start, maybe to give sort of a better understanding of the period or an event or a person. But you really want to go and deep, again, what I was saying earlier, like dive in, right? Go deeper. I love the idea about the travel guides. We use those for the Blessed and the Blasphemous. We actually found tours organized in the 1930s from various hotels, one that Patrick found in Casablanca. So those were fantastic. We knew where they were going, what they were going to explore, the type of ruins. Awesome. We love those. I love also the idea of primary sources. And if I may add to this, especially for Journal d'Indochine and for the Blessed and Blasphemous, National Archives. They're a fantastic source of information. Again, it could be newspaper articles, photos, but also newsreels. And we tend to use those quite a bit on our side. So those are a great source to sort of see and feel what it looked like at that time. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I'm going to, just because I've done a lot of this work, I'm going to highlight a couple of specific things. I'm not a trained historian, but these are some tools. One, if you, especially in the US, the Library of Congress is a phenomenal resource for photographs. They have a collection of blueprints and photographs of houses, so you can look at architecture. Equally importantly, during the Depression, they sent, as part of the Works Progress Administration, they sent ethnographers and storytellers out just to roam the countryside, interview people, and get their stories. And there is no better way to situate yourself right in the community than to find an interview with someone who lived there, where they just basically talk about their life. Like that was the command, to talk about your life. And they have, because it was the 30s, they had some people who were, either formerly enslaved or, the children of those people, talking about that. People living through the Depression, people from different ethnic communities. And so I want to highlight that as well. I have a newspaper.com subscription. That is the single most valuable thing I have for research. It's something like $12 a month. So if you don't need it for a whole year, that's fine. Because what you miss if you limit yourself to Wikipedia, or if you limit yourself to the big newspapers, is you miss the voices of other communities, especially in the 20s and earlier, which were hyper racist and classist. And I bring this up in Baltimore, which I did a ton of work there. The Baltimore Sun was the biggest paper at the time. And if you read the Baltimore Sun, just to be frank, right, white people were always the heroes. And the only time they reported on the Black community was when they were arrested for something. And if you read only the Sun, you would get the impression that that's how things were. But in Baltimore, we had the Baltimore Afro-American, which was the largest and most sophisticated Black newspaper in the country at that time. Completely different worldview, right? And you've got to look at both. If you're right, and there's also, there were Jewish papers, Czech, Bohemian papers, not always in English, so if you can read them, great. But the point, these things are there. If you're writing for Down Darker Trails, indigenous nations had their own newspapers. Read those. They're mostly in English, at least the ones on newspaper.com are. You can go to like Sioux Falls and say, show me all the newspapers that were here in 1875. And it's, a mixture of like people advertising, dried mashed potato powder, and talking about who was found dead mysteriously on the road, and talking about like, hey, we're really afraid of this or that or the other. Like, it's, you just and trained historians will know this better than I, but just to remember that primary sources are written by people, and those people have biases, and those people choose to ignore or enhance certain things. So try to get past that and pull in as much as you can, so you can present a true setting, which is always interesting, more interesting than a fictionalized setting.
And if I may, that is one of the really almost sad things in a way with the birth and development of the internet. Is even in my lifetime, in the village I grew up in, there were at least 2 local papers and 2 free local newspapers. You didn't even have to pay for them, and they would have various news things. And I think that's a resource that we've definitely seen shrink in terms of availability for the modern world. But as you say, thankfully, the internet has managed to preserve a lot of the older ones so that they are more accessible than they've ever been.
Yeah, and we have one other question from the chat, but also I just find it really soothing. It's maybe how my brain is wired to look at old menus and restaurant advertisements and stuff. Like, I'm just, it's a sicko thing, but if someone's like, I need you to tell me what, a fancy meal on the, Baltimore and Ohio railway looked like in 1928, I'm like, I got it. It's great.
Uh,
There
if I may just jump in as well on this,
Yes.
because I think it could resonate well with our audience. Another source that I forgot to mention, and I'm not sure if other panelists use it, but National Geographic. I mean, you read old National Geographic articles, they're fantastic, but because they often focus on these strange moments, conspiracy strategies, mysteries. So don't hesitate to get a subscription to National Geographic.
That's great. That's the the old ones where there's no pictures on the cover, right? It's just the table of contents. Yeah, fantastic.
I would
You're in
also
for a
say
good time.
40 times as well if you really want your weird stuff. Although they have tended to go a lot towards UFOs and aliens
Yeah.
over the last couple of years. There's still some really weird stuff in there, ghosts wise, alien big cats, you name it. So, if you like your 40 times, get in there.
Yeah. Yeah, the conspiracy stuff is fun, up to a point, right? There's the if you go far enough, it's always turns into anti-Semitism. But up before that point, it's entertaining.
Yeah.
So oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, just to further that, and like that's always the one thing in terms of doing the historical research, is that drawing that line, particularly when writing for Mythos, is getting up to that, but not falling into those awful conspiracy theories that genuinely led to a lot of the atrocities that have happened throughout history.
Yeah.
And just it's sort of delving into it, but not going definitely not going all the way, and to recognize that.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask Lynne, just because you have, I think, both the writing on your own Steam and as a representative of Chaosium. Someone asked about whether it's appropriate or acceptable to use photos of real people. I don't know if that's an open and shut answer or if that's a judgment call, but I figured I'd ask you first.
Well, it's something that we actually used to do for a lot of our pre-gens back in the day when we didn't have much of a budget. So,
Okay.
Wikimedia Commons got
Yes.
raided quite a lot. Obviously, usage of that now is getting legally very, very complicated, depending on who's put it up, which Creative Commons license they've put it under. Depending on what country you're in, it's a lot clearer cut in the States, funnily enough, than it is in England. So, it's, while, at your own table, why not? No one's going to stop you. Absolutely fine. Obviously, certainly from our viewpoint, it's just far too complicated to keep track of who did what to who, when, who owns that photo, do they genuinely own that photo? Something that we used, because this did actually come up when we were checking something, something had originally been open free usage, and then whoever put it up originally had changed it to Creative Commons, which meant that our usage of it could have been a bit dodgy. But how were we meant to know that they changed it? So just, if you're in doubt, just don't do it, and save yourself a lot of pain.
Yeah, and one research thing that I want to recommend: as you pull these things out, make sure you have links to everything,
Yes.
because it's a heartbreaker when you have an amazing image or quote and then you can't figure out where you got it from, so you're not sure if you can use it. So just even I would even paste the link before you paste in the content.
Yeah, well, heck, I handwrite down the links, and even then, literally this year, I got caught. I'd done some research at the end of last year. I thought I'd written down the link properly, but I'd only written down part of it. I went to try and find it again. It's gone, completely gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things, like at the beginning of the books that I use, just use, sort of learning from what reading the Chaosium one is to have a link to every bit of media that isn't something from one of my artists, because they're pretty clear, and I include that in a separate section. That any modified photo or just standard photo that I use, even if it's a public domain one, just state it as a whole list.
Yeah, that's great. So we are a little over. There was one question, and I understand if people need to go, but we didn't get to this question yet. But the question was, when you're developing a story or a storyline, how much do you borrow from other authors? to help legitimize and proliferate their ideas, or to help create a shared universe? Or are you worried? So I guess, so the example from Chris was like Weird Tales authors crossing over. So if you're working in a setting, a real historical setting, and Chris, you can correct me if I'm misrepresenting you, you're working in this historical setting, there's an author there that you love, and you want to touch on their work. To simplify this, let's assume it's in the public domain already. So this is, Arthur Machen or Lovecraft or somebody, that, so you're not like having to clear rights. But have you built on a shared universe? How do you feel about doing that?
We're all creating a shared universe. This is our mythos now. This is our shared version of the mythos, which has always been a shared world. So in many ways, we're always self-referencing. But yeah, we use public domain creatures. We might not necessarily come out and state it, but we might, it might be sort of like your Easter egg that you hide in there that's a reference that people who know it will get it, but it's not going to hurt if people don't. So I think we do it all the time.
Yeah. And it
You
turns
just
out
have to
that
be
I've got the
careful if it's
question totally wrong. Sorry. But it was actually about Miskatonic repository writers borrowing and building on each other. And I believe, I'm not speaking forecasting here, but I believe the policy is once it's on the repository, it's available because it's now part of the license, right? It's available for other people to build on. I mean, not to plagiarize word for word, but to, if you see someone else's scenario and you're like, I love this, I want to do more with this, you can, right? Question mark. I think so. We may want to double check with Nick or someone else, Nick Brook. But I believe that's the case. There may be like a courtesy you may want to drop. Right, exactly. Leslie, you may want to reach out to them for politeness.
And just as a matter of permission, if I can do a brief plug, not so much for me, but for the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, I was getting permission from them to use some of their fonts for some of the handouts that I was doing, and discovered in the process, because I was telling them what I was doing, is they had produced or were in the process of producing a monograph called The Discovery of Fragments of Kitab al-Azif at Haran, which seemed to be tangentially related to what I was doing, even though it wasn't directly. So I bought a copy of it, and then I said, can I actually use this as a resource in the sequel to my first scenario? And they did, and I made sure to include a link, but in the scenario itself that you can actually click on and go to the historic their website and buy it. But so this is now an actual mythos tome in what I wrote under their guidance and connection. So special thanks to Andrew Lehman and Sean Brandy especially.
Yes.
For that. So now that's something that, that's one example. Always with permission, always in contact with people.
Yes. Yeah, and do reach out, because we are a community and we function best as a community. So I think most people would be pleased and honored as long as you are not like doing something horrible with their stuff. And might have tips, might have like, oh, I always wanted to see that. Here are my thoughts. We are now over time. I apologize greatly. Would everyone just quickly go through and tell people if you're open to creators reaching out to you, how they can reach you, what your preferred method is? We'll start with John.
Absolutely. You can either find me on Discord. I'm just going to put my email address in the chat, and you can get a hold of me that way.
Great, thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, so email is the best way to get a hold of me. Happy for anyone to reach out. Mind your expectations in terms of me getting back to you, but absolutely, it's something I love to do. I love getting in touch with other creators and finding opportunities where there's common ground, and there usually is a lot. So please reach out, email in the chat. Thanks.
Francis.
Yeah, similar. I think success comes with collaboration. We all talked about it, right? If it's editors or sharing ideas or resources. So absolutely collaboration is key. I would also just to say, have fun, right? If you're not having fun while you're producing or preparing a project, again, it's not worth doing. So more than happy to collaborate. I'll also put in my my email. Thank you so thank you so much again,
you.
Evan, for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Lynn?
Well, you can reach me by my first name at chaosium.com. Please make sure you spell it correctly or it's not going to get to me. Happy to mentor people. Obviously, my time is reasonably limited. So again, turnaround may be a little bit slow, and I do apologize for that if you do reach out to me. But yes, thank you very much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.